Imagine for a moment being hundreds of kilometers from the nearest shore, surrounded only by dark waters stretching to the endless horizon. The wind cuts your skin like blades of ice, and the only thing between you and the relentless ocean is a wooden hull that creaks and groans with every wave. Now imagine it's midnight. The temperature has dropped to well below freezing, and you need to survive until dawn. How did millions of sailors throughout history manage not only to survive, but to thrive under conditions that would kill most of us within hours? The answer lies not only in the physical endurance of these men of the sea, but in a complex network of techniques, rituals, and knowledge passed down from generation to generation, often kept as family secrets within maritime communities. Some of these methods were so effective, they are still used today by polar explorers and extreme survivalists. Others were so dangerous they cost more lives than they saved. But before we dive into these fascinating techniques, we need to understand something fundamental. Why is the cold at sea so different and so much more deadly than the cold on dry land? Water has a thermal capacity 25 times greater than air. This means your body loses heat 25 times faster when wet than when dry. At sea, even if you don't fall into the water, the constant humidity of the salty air, combined with ocean winds, creates an environment where hypothermia can set in within minutes. Ancient sailors didn't have thermometers to measure temperature, but they developed their own system. When saliva froze before hitting the deck, they knew it was time to implement their most extreme survival strategies. One of these strategies was something 18th century whalers called the circle of life. No, it wasn't about philosophy. It was a literal matter of life and death. During the coldest nights, sailors organized themselves into groups of 3 or 4 men and took turns in 2-hour shifts. While 2 slept squeezed like sardines inside sealskin sleeping bags, a 3rd stayed awake doing constant physical exercises, push-ups, jumping jacks, any movement that kept blood flowing. The 4th man stood watch, not only to look out for dangers at sea, but to ensure the exercising man kept moving, because stopping meant freezing to death in less than an hour. But you might be wondering, how did they manage to sleep in such cold? The answer lies in an accidental discovery that saved countless lives over the centuries. In 1847, a whaling ship called the Northern Star was trapped in Arctic ice for 4 months. When fuel supplies ran out, the crew faced a terrible choice: burn parts of the ship to keep warm or find an alternative. That's when the ship's cook, a man named Magnus Ericsson, made a discovery that would forever change maritime survival: techniques. Ericsson realized that whale oil, when mixed with pieces of fabric and placed in small metal containers, could burn for hours without producing toxic smoke. More importantly, he discovered that by placing these small improvised heaters inside sleeping bags, sailors could create microenvironments with stable body temperatures. The trick was in the proportion: too much oil and the sailor would be burned alive. Too little oil and they'd freeze. The exact measure became knowledge so valuable it was passed only to the most trusted crew members. But there was a problem with this technique, a deadly problem. Whale oil was a limited and extremely valuable resource. Using too much for personal heating could mean not having enough fuel to cook or to light the ship during dangerous nighttime navigation. This created a cruel hierarchy aboard ships. Senior officers had access to the oil heaters, while common sailors had to find more creative alternatives. And that is where despair bred innovation in ways you could never imagine. Sailors began to discover that certain foods could act as internal body fuel in surprising ways. We're not just talking about calories. Anyone knows that eating more helps keep you warm. We're talking about specific food combinations that created chemical reactions in the body, capable of maintaining a high body temperature for hours on end. One of these combinations was a mixture of rum, honey, pork fat, and a pinch of red pepper that sailors called devil's blood. The exact recipe varied from ship to ship, but the basic ingredients were always the same. The rum dilated blood vessels, allowing warm blood to reach the extremities of the body. The honey provided quick-burning energy, while the pork fat offered slow-burning energy. The red pepper sped up metabolism, causing the body to burn calories faster and consequently produce more heat. But there was an even more important secret in preparing this mixture. It had to be consumed in small doses, throughout the night, not all at once. Drinking it all at once could cause such intense vasodilation that the sailor would actually lose body heat more quickly. Experienced navigators developed a system where each man took a small sip every 30 minutes throughout the night. Still, not all ships had access to these precious ingredients. So what did poorer sailors do? Those on merchant ships that barely had enough food to survive, let alone ingredients for warming potions. The answer lies in one of the most disturbing discoveries in maritime history, and one that few history books dare to mention. During months-long Arctic expeditions, when all conventional resources ran out, some sailors resorted to a practice they called fraternal warming. It was exactly what the name suggested: adult men sleeping cuddled up, skin to skin, sharing body heat throughout the night. But it wasn't just a matter of snuggling. There was precise science behind this technique. Sailors discovered that body positioning was crucial. The warmest man, usually the one with the most body fat, stayed in the middle, while the leaner men positioned themselves on the sides. They took turns every 2 hours, ensuring everyone had the chance to be in the warmest spot. More importantly, they found that keeping one man's feet against another's chest created a circulation circuit that could keep both alive, even in temperatures that would kill men alone. This practice saved thousands of lives over the centuries, but also created a social taboo that persisted for generations. Many sailors preferred to freeze to death rather than admit they had used this survival technique. Ship captains often pretended not to know it was happening on their ships, even when it meant the difference between arriving at port with a living crew or with a ship full of frozen corpses. But perhaps the most ingenious and most dangerous technique developed by sailors was something called controlled hibernation. It was such a risky practice that many captains banned it outright, but it was so effective that it continued to be used secretly for decades. Controlled hibernation worked like this. A sailor deliberately lowered his body temperature to a state close to hypothermia, but not beyond the point of no return. In this state, the body consumed much less oxygen and energy, allowing the sailor to survive with less food and generate less body heat, but also lose less heat to the environment. It was like putting the human body into an energy-saving mode. The trick was knowing exactly when to stop. Too cold and the sailor would never wake up. Not cold enough and the technique wouldn't work. Masters of this art developed bodily signals they could monitor even in a semi-conscious state. When the nails turned bluish-gray, but not completely blue, when breathing slowed to less than 6 breaths per minute, but no fewer than 4, when the pulse became almost imperceptible, but still detectable. An experienced sailor could maintain this state for up to 6 hours straight, waking periodically to check his condition and make small adjustments. It was like walking a tightrope between life and death, and many who tried this technique ended up on the wrong side of the equation. But why were some sailors willing to take such extreme risks? The answer leads us to an aspect of maritime life that is rarely discussed: the economy of survival. On 19th and 20th century ships, resources like food, fuel, and even fresh water were strictly rationed. A sailor who managed to survive cold nights, using fewer resources, not only increased his own chances of survival, but also improved the chances of the entire crew. This created intense social pressure for sailors to develop ever more efficient survival techniques. Some ships implemented heat credit systems, where sailors who survived a cold night using fewer resources earned the right to extra rations or better sleeping positions on subsequent nights. This encouraged innovation, but also created deadly competition, where men risked their lives to prove they were tougher than their mates. It was in this competitive context that one of the most bizarre techniques in maritime history emerged: the controlled ice bath. It might sound contradictory. How could wetting oneself with ice-cold water help someone survive the cold? But the science behind this technique was solid, even if sailors at the time did not fully understand how it worked. When exposed to very cold water for short, controlled periods, the human body enters a state called adaptive thermogenesis. Essentially, the body learns to produce heat more efficiently. Experienced sailors developed routines where they deliberately soaked themselves with seawater for exactly 30 seconds, then dried off vigorously and dressed quickly. This thermal shock trained their bodies to react faster to the cold, allowing them to survive temperatures that would incapacitate untrained sailors. But there was a crucial and deadly adaptation period. During early attempts, many sailors died from thermal shock or developed pneumonia. Only those with expert supervision and exceptional physical conditions managed to master this technique. What makes this story even more fascinating is how these techniques spread among maritime communities. There were no books or manuals. This entire body of knowledge was passed orally, from experienced sailors to novices, often during the very cold nights they were trying to survive. Some techniques were guarded like trade secrets. Ship captains who knew especially effective methods to keep their crews alive during Arctic voyages could charge higher premiums for their expeditions. Entire families of sailors developed survival recipes that were passed only to sons and sons-in-law, creating knowledge lineages that lasted for generations. But not all knowledge was benevolent. Some captains deliberately kept their crews ignorant of more effective survival techniques, knowing that desperate sailors were more obedient and less likely to mutiny. This created a dark economy where survival knowledge became a form of power and control. It was in this environment that one of the most controversial figures in maritime history emerged: the Masters of the Cold. These were sailors who specialized in survival techniques for extreme temperatures and sold their services to captains willing to pay. These men knew secrets that could make the difference between a successful expedition and a ghost ship full of frozen corpses. One of these masters, known only as Bjorn the Immortal, supposedly developed a technique that allowed sailors to survive up to 12 hours in temperatures where death would normally occur in less than 2 hours. His technique involved a combination of specific breathing exercises, precise body positioning, and a mysterious substance he applied to the sailor's skin. Bjorn never fully revealed his technique, but sailors who worked with him reported some intriguing details. The substance he used had a strong fishy smell and left the skin with a tingling sensation that lasted for hours. The breathing exercises involved inhaling through the nose for exactly 7 seconds, holding the breath for 3 seconds and exhaling through the mouth for 10 seconds. The body positioning required sailors to hold a specific posture that kept the vital organs warm, while allowing the extremities to cool in a controlled manner. What we know about these techniques comes mainly from the diaries of sailors who survived impossible expeditions. One particularly detailed diary, found on a shipwreck in the Arctic in 1923, describes a night when the temperature was so low that the seawater began to form ice crystals. The sailor who wrote the diary reported that he and his companions survived using a technique they called the polar bear breathing. The technique involved synchronizing the breathing of the entire crew, creating a collective rhythm that supposedly helped keep everyone warm. Each man placed a hand on the chest of the man beside him, and all breathed in unison. A slow, deep inhalation for 8 seconds, a hold for 2 seconds, and a controlled exhalation for 10 seconds. The diary claims that this synchronization created a shared heat field that kept the whole group warm. While this may sound like superstition, modern scientific evidence suggests that synchronized breathing can indeed affect body temperature through the autonomic nervous system. Groups of people breathing in sync can mutually influence their heart rhythms and consequently their blood circulation. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these survival techniques is how they reveal the extraordinary ability of the human body to adapt to extreme conditions. Sailors who spent months at sea developed physical adaptations that literally made them different from people living on solid ground. Their bodies learned to conserve heat in ways that would surprise modern doctors. Some developed an extra layer of subcutaneous fat only in specific areas of the body, around the vital organs and major arteries. Others developed an increased capacity for vasoconstriction, allowing them to redirect blood flow from the limbs to vital organs with an efficiency rivaling that of Arctic mammals. There are reports of veteran sailors who could literally shut down blood circulation in their arms and legs for short periods, preserving core body heat for essential organs. This ability was developed through years of controlled exposure to extreme cold and meditation techniques. that allowed conscious control over bodily functions normally automatic. But these adaptations came at a price. Many veteran sailors developed chronic health problems related to their years at sea. Early arthritis, circulatory issues, and a condition they called ice bones, a deep bone pain that persisted even in warm climates. Some never fully readapted to life on land. Their bodies had become so specialized for survival in extreme conditions that normal climate actually made them uncomfortable. There are reports of retired sailors who slept outside during winter because they couldn't feel comfortable inside heated houses. This extreme specialization leads us to a disturbing question. How many sailors throughout history died, not from a lack of knowledge about survival techniques, but from attempting methods that were too advanced for their levels of experience? Naval archives are full of reports of expeditions where inexperienced sailors tried to imitate techniques they had heard from veterans, only to discover that these methods required years of physical and mental conditioning. It was like trying to run a marathon after hearing someone describe how it's done. Theoretical knowledge was not enough without proper physical preparation. This led to the development of informal graduation systems within maritime communities. Novice sailors first learned basic survival techniques, then gradually progressed to more advanced methods as they gained experience and physical conditioning. The veterans served as mentors, carefully monitoring the novices to ensure they didn't attempt techniques beyond their capabilities. But even with these safety systems, cold nights at sea remained a deadly test of human endurance. The difference between survivors and victims often came down to seemingly insignificant details. Knowing the difference between productive shivering, which generates heat, and destructive shivering, which wastes energy. Understanding when to force the body to stay awake and when to allow energy-conserving sleep, and realizing how the full moon could affect the perceived temperature through the reflection of light on the waves. These details meant the difference between seeing another dawn or becoming just another statistic in the unforgiving waters of the ocean. For millions of sailors over the centuries, mastering these secrets was not just a matter of comfort, it was literally a matter of life or death. The techniques they developed, tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, continue to influence modern survival methods. Polar explorers, soldiers in Arctic environments, and even astronauts still use principles derived from these methods developed by desperate men on wooden ships hundreds of years ago. The next time you feel cold on a winter night, remember these men who transformed survival into an art, who found warmth where there was none, and who passed down a legacy of human endurance that continues to save lives today. They proved that even in the most impossible circumstances, the combination of knowledge, determination, and human solidarity can overcome forces that seem insurmountable. Their stories are more than survival accounts. They are testimonies to the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to adapt, innovate, and persevere, even when facing the most brutal forces of nature.